The bullet grazed Penelope Zimmerman's fence post so close she felt the splinter bite her cheek, and when she wheeled around with her rifle already cocked, she found Zane Walker standing across the property line with his hands raised and his hat tilted back, looking more shocked than she felt. "Don't shoot," he said, his voice carrying across the 20 yards between them in the cool September evening of 1882. "That was meant for the coyote behind your henhouse." Penelope didn't lower her rifle. Her property in Pueblo, Colorado had been her sanctuary for 3 years now, ever since her father died and left her this 120 acres bordering the Walker Ranch. The Walkers had tried to buy her out twice. She'd refused both times, and the grudge between their families had grown deeper than the Arkansas River that cut through the valley below. "There's no coyote," she said flatly. Zane pointed past her shoulder, and against her better judgment, she glanced back. Sure enough, a mangy coyote was slinking away from her chicken coop, a hen dangling from its jaws. By the time she looked back at Zane, he'd already crossed the property line and was walking toward her barn. "Get back on your side," she called out, but he ignored her. She watched him stride across her land like he owned it, his long legs eating up the distance in his worn boots. He was tall, probably 6 feet and then some, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rocks that dotted the landscape around Pueblo. She hated that she noticed. Zane reached her henhouse and examined the broken latch. "He got in through here. I can fix it. I can fix my own property. Thank you very much." He turned to face her then, and even in the dimming light she could see his eyes were a startling blue. "Miss Zimmerman, I know we got history, but I'm not about to let you lose more chickens because you're too stubborn to accept help from a Walker." "History," she laughed without humor. "Your father tried to steal my water rights last spring. Your brother drove my cattle onto the main road where 2 of them got hit by a freight wagon, and you personally told the bank I was a bad risk when I tried to get a loan to expand my herd." Zane's jaw tightened. "I never said that to any bank. Your father did then. Same difference." "It's not the same, and you know it." He took a step toward her, still on her side of the property line. "My father does what he wants, and I don't always agree with it. Neither does my mother, for what that's worth." Penelope had met Margaret Walker once at the general store. The woman had been kind, apologizing for her husband's behavior with tired eyes that suggested she'd been apologizing for him for years. "That didn't change anything, though. I don't care about your family dynamics. I care about you getting off my land." Instead of leaving, Zane walked to her barn and disappeared inside. Penelope stood there for a moment, stunned by his audacity, before following him. She found him examining her barn doors, which had been hanging crooked for weeks. "You need new hinges here," he said, running his hand along the weathered wood. "And this beam is starting to rot. You got water damage from somewhere. I know what my barn needs." "Then why haven't you fixed it?" Because she couldn't afford to hire help, and she couldn't do the heavy lifting alone, and she was too proud to ask anyone in town for assistance, because they all thought a woman had no business running a ranch by herself anyway. She didn't say any of that. "That's not your concern." Zane studied her for a long moment. The last light of day was fading fast, and she'd need to light the lantern soon. She was acutely aware that they were alone, that her nearest neighbor besides the Walkers was 3 miles down the road, that this man could do anything he wanted and no one would hear her scream. But he just nodded slowly and said, "All right, I'll go. But I'm coming back tomorrow to fix your henhouse latch and your barn doors, and you can shoot me then if you want, but I'm doing it anyway. Don't you dare step foot on my property again. Too late. Already stepped plenty." He walked past her, close enough that she could smell horse and leather and something else, maybe sage. "Good night, Miss Zimmerman." She watched him cross back over the property line, his figure disappearing into the darkness toward the Walker Ranch house. She could see lights in the windows of his family's home, warm and golden. Her own house would be cold and dark until she went inside and built up the fire. Penelope cursed under her breath and went to check on her remaining chickens. True to his infuriating word, Zane Walker appeared at sunrise the next morning with a toolbox and lumber balanced on his shoulder. Penelope was already up, feeding her horses, when she spotted him crossing the property line like it didn't exist. "I told you not to come back," she called out. "You did," he agreed, setting down his supplies near her henhouse. "I'm here anyway." She marched over to him, ready to physically throw him off her land if necessary, but he'd already started working on the broken latch. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and she found herself watching the way his shoulders moved under his shirt as he worked. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded. "Because it needs doing." "That's not an answer." Zane looked up at her, squinting against the morning sun. "Maybe I'm tired of the grudge. Maybe I think it's gone on long enough. Or maybe I just don't like seeing good land go to ruin because of pride." "My land isn't going to ruin. It's getting there." He returned to his work. "You're doing your best, I can see that. But you can't run a ranch this size alone. Nobody can. My father did. Your father had 3 hired hands and your mother helping with the books." He was right, which only made her angrier. Before her mother died of influenza when Penelope was 16, the Zimmerman ranch had been prosperous. Her father had held on for 4 more years, but after he died of a heart attack in the summer of 1879, Penelope had been left with debts, aging equipment, and neighbors who thought she should sell and move to town to become a schoolteacher or a seamstress or someone's wife. She'd fought too hard to keep this place to give it up now. "I'm managing just fine." Zane finished with the latch and tested it several times. Satisfied, he moved to the barn. Penelope followed, hating herself for it but unable to stop. "Your property's in better shape than ours," she said, gesturing toward the Walker spread. From her vantage point, she could see their larger barn, their extensive corrals, their herds of cattle dotting the hillsides. "We have money and men," Zane said simply. "Doesn't make us better ranchers. Just means we have more help." He examined the barn doors, taking measurements with a piece of string. "My father wants to expand east. He's got his eye on the Morrison property." Penelope knew the Morrison family. They'd left Pueblo last year after their eldest son died in a mining accident. The land had sat empty since then. "Why are you telling me this?" "So you know he's not focused on your property anymore. He's moved on to other acquisitions." She didn't know if that should make her feel better or worse. "He still wants my water rights." "Probably." Zane started removing the old hinges. "But he's not going to get them, is he?" "No." "Good." They worked in silence for a while, or rather, Zane worked while Penelope pretended to do chores nearby but mostly watched him. He was good with his hands, she noticed, careful and precise. When he took off his hat because the sun was getting high, she saw that his hair was damp with sweat at the temples. "How old are you?" The question came out before she could stop it. He glanced at her with mild surprise. 25. "You?" 23. "Young to be running a ranch alone." "Old enough," she said defensively. "Didn't say you weren't." He lifted the barn door off its frame with a grunt of effort, and she instinctively moved to help him, grabbing the other side. Their eyes met over the weathered wood. "Thanks." They set the door against the barn wall, and Penelope stepped back quickly, brushing off her hands. "I didn't do it to help you. I did it so you wouldn't drop it and break something else." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Right." That smile did something strange to her insides, and she turned away before he could see her face flush. This was ridiculous. He was a Walker. The enemy. The reason she'd spent the last 3 years fighting tooth and nail to keep her land, except he wasn't his father, was he. He'd said as much last night. Do you actually work your ranch, or do you just spend your time fixing other people's property? She asked, aiming for a sharp tone but landing somewhere closer to curious. I work it. Up before dawn, don't finish until after dark most days. But I saw your hen house yesterday and knew if I didn't fix it, you'd lose more chickens. Couldn't sleep thinking about it. Why would you care about my chickens? Zane picked up the new hinges he'd brought. I care about waste, and letting good animals die because of a broken latch is wasteful. It was a practical answer, not a sentimental one, and somehow that made it more believable. Penelope found herself relaxing slightly, though she kept her guard up. Your father know you're here? No. He started attaching the new hinges. He's in Denver this week on business. Won't be back until Saturday. And if he finds out, then we'll have words, I expect. Won't be the first time. Zane's jaw tightened as he worked, and she wondered what kind of words he'd had with his father before. Loud ones, she imagined. Angry ones. By midday, he'd replaced both barn doors and rehung them so they swung smoothly and true. Penelope had to admit, grudgingly, that they looked better than they had in months. Thank you, she said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. Zane wiped his hands on his pants and picked up his toolbox. You're welcome, Miss Zimmerman. Penelope, she said, then immediately wondered why she'd offered her first name. His expression softened. Zane. They stood there for a moment, the afternoon sun beating down on them, dust motes dancing in the air between them. A hawk cried out overhead, circling on the thermals rising from the hot earth. I should go, he said finally. Yes. But he didn't move, and neither did she. Something hung in the air between them, unspoken and fragile as spun glass. Can I come back tomorrow? He asked. You've got fence that needs mending along the south pasture. I noticed it yesterday. You were surveying my property yesterday. I was noticing things that needed attention. She should say no. She should send him away and keep the grudge alive where it belonged. But her fence did need mending, and she'd been putting it off because it was back-breaking work for one person, and suddenly she was tired of being alone. Fine, she said, but only because the fence needs fixing. That smile again, quick and devastating, only because of the fence. He left then, crossing back to Walker land, and Penelope went inside her house and sat down hard in her father's old chair. Her heart was beating too fast, and her hands were trembling, and she couldn't decide if she was angry or excited or terrified. Probably all three. Zane came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each time he brought tools and supplies and his steady, capable presence. They fixed the south fence, replaced rotting boards in her corral, and patched the leaking roof on her storage shed. And each day, Penelope found herself looking forward to sunrise a little more, found herself watching the property line a little more eagerly. They talked while they worked. Small things at first. The weather, the cattle market, the new family that had moved to town. Then bigger things. He told her about growing up as the eldest son of Gerald Walker, about the pressure to live up to his father's expectations, about his younger brother Thomas, who wanted to be a lawyer instead of a rancher, and their father's disappointment. She told him about losing her mother, about her father's slow decline afterward, about the loneliness of running the ranch alone, about the way men in town looked at her, like she was playing dress-up in her father's life instead of living her own. They're fools, Zane said one afternoon as they stood in her pasture, checking the new fence posts they'd set. You're doing what most of them couldn't do. Your father doesn't think so. My father thinks anyone without a Walker surname is beneath his notice. He's wrong about a lot of things." Zane turned to face her, his blue eyes serious. "He's especially wrong about you." Her breath caught. They were standing too close, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun, close enough to see the exact shade of blue in his irises. "Zane," she said, but she didn't know how to finish the sentence. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers were calloused and gentle, and she stood frozen as he tucked the hair behind her ear. "I should stop coming here," he said quietly, "before this becomes more complicated than it already is." "Yes," she whispered, "you should, but I don't want to. I don't want you to either." The admission hung between them. His hand was still near her face, and she could feel the warmth of it. The sun was setting behind him, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossibly vivid. "My father would disown me," Zane said. "The whole town would talk. We're supposed to hate each other." "I know." "I don't hate you, Penelope. I don't think I ever did." Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "I don't hate you either." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his whole face, and suddenly he looked younger and lighter and so handsome she couldn't breathe. Then he was leaning in, and she was rising on her toes, and their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff at the same time. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and she melted into him. He tasted like coffee and mint, and his body was solid and warm against hers. The kiss deepened, and she forgot about the grudge, forgot about their families, forgot about everything except the feeling of his mouth on hers and his hands in her hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the sun had dipped below the horizon and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "I'm in trouble," Zane said, resting his forehead against hers. "We both are." But neither of them moved away. They stood there in the gathering darkness, holding each other, and Penelope felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been tight and guarded for so long was finally opening up, like a flower blooming after a long winter. "Stay for dinner," she said impulsively. He pulled back to look at her. "Are you sure?" "No, but stay anyway." So he did. They walked back to her house together, no longer bothering to stay on opposite sides of the property line. Penelope cooked beans and cornbread while Zane built up the fire, and they ate at her small kitchen table like it was the most natural thing in the world. "This is good," he said around a mouthful of cornbread. "Better than what our cook makes." "You have a cook?" "And a housekeeper and ranch hands and an accountant who comes once a month from Denver." He shook his head. "My father likes to live well. Must be nice. It's comfortable, but it's not happy. There's a difference." He met her eyes across the table. "This feels more like a home than my house has ever felt." Penelope's throat tightened. "It's lonely most of the time. Maybe it doesn't have to be." They finished eating in comfortable silence, and then Zane helped her wash the dishes. Standing side by side at her basin, their shoulders brushing, felt intimate in a way that made her pulse race. When the last dish was dried and put away, they stood in her small kitchen and looked at each other. "I should go," Zane said, but he didn't move. "It's dark. You could stay." The words came out before she could think better of them. "In the spare room, I mean, my father's old room." His eyes darkened. "Penelope, it's practical. You just have to ride home and then come back tomorrow anyway. If anyone found out, who's going to know? Your father's in Denver. There's no one around for miles." He studied her face for a long moment. "Is this what you want?" The question was loaded with meaning. He wasn't just asking if she wanted him to stay the night in a spare room. He was asking if she wanted him, if she wanted this thing growing between them, if she wanted to cross a line they couldn't uncross. "Yes," she said simply. So he stayed. She showed him to her father's old room, which she kept clean but rarely entered. It still smelled faintly of her father's tobacco, and the sight of Zane in that space felt wrong and right at the same time. "There's extra blankets in the trunk if you get cold," she said awkwardly, "and I'm just across the hall if you need anything. Thank you." He caught her hand as she turned to leave, raising it to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Penelope." She barely slept that night. Every creak of the house made her aware of his presence, of the fact that Zane Walker was sleeping under her roof, breathing the same air. It felt momentous and terrifying and thrilling all at once. When she emerged the next morning, she found him already up, feeding her horses in the barn. He'd found the oats and the hay without asking, had figured out which horses were which. He looked up when she approached, and his smile was like sunrise, morning. "You didn't have to do my chores." "I was up anyway, couldn't sleep." "Me neither." They stood there grinning at each other like fools until one of the horses nudged Penelope's shoulder impatiently. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of work and stolen glances. Zane showed her a better way to muck out the stalls. She showed him where she planned to plant winter wheat. They worked together like they'd been doing it for years. When noon came, Penelope made sandwiches and they ate sitting on her porch, looking out over her property. The land rolled out before them in shades of brown and gold, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional cottonwood tree. In the distance, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rose up purple against the brilliant blue sky. "It's beautiful," Zane said quietly. "It is. That's why I fight so hard to keep it. I understand that now." He set down his sandwich and turned to face her. "Penelope, I need to tell you something. About why my father wanted your property so badly." Her stomach clenched. "What?" "There's a railroad company looking to lay track through this area. They've been surveying routes for months. One of the routes they're considering would cut right through your northern pasture." She stared at him. "What? If they choose that route, your land becomes worth 3 times what it is now, maybe more. My father found out about it last year. That's why he tried to buy you out." Anger flared hot in her chest. "He was trying to cheat me." "Yes. And you knew about this." "Not at first. I found out 3 months ago when I overheard him talking to his lawyer." Zane's face was earnest, almost desperate. "That's part of why I started coming over here. I wanted to warn you, but I didn't know how without betraying my father. Then I got to know you and everything got more complicated." Penelope stood up, pacing the length of the porch. Her mind was racing. A railroad through her property, the money that could bring, the security, but also the destruction, the noise, the end of the ranch as she knew it. "Does he know you told me?" "No, and he can't find out, Penelope. If he knows I told you, he'll do everything in his power to make your life hell. He might even try to force the railroad to choose the other route out of spite." "Why should I trust you? This could be another trick." Zane stood and crossed to her, taking her shoulders gently in his hands. "Because I'm risking everything to tell you this. Because I've spent every day for the past week helping you instead of working my own ranch. Because I kissed you yesterday and I want to do it again, and I wouldn't do any of that if I was trying to cheat you." She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception. All she saw was sincerity and something deeper, something that looked like the same feelings churning in her own chest. "What do I do?" she asked quietly. "You wait, don't sell, don't let anyone pressure you. When the railroad makes their final decision, you'll have all the power. You can negotiate your own terms." His hands slid down her arms. "And in the meantime, you let me keep helping you. Keep this place running. Make sure you're in the strongest position possible when that day comes." "Why would you help me against your own father?" "Because he's wrong. Because you deserve better. Because—" He paused, his eyes searching hers. "Because I'm falling for you and I can't seem to stop it even though I know I should." Her breath caught. The words she'd been feeling but couldn't name suddenly hung in the air between them, real and undeniable. "I'm falling for you too," she whispered. "I've been trying not to. How's that working?" "Terribly." He laughed then, and the sound was so warm and genuine that she couldn't help but join in. Then he was kissing her again, deeper this time, more certain. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with everything she had. When they broke apart, both flushed and breathing hard, Zane rested his forehead against hers. "This is going to be complicated," he said. "I know. My father will fight this, fight us. I know that too. I don't care, I'm not giving you up," her heart soared. "Good. Because I'm not letting you go either." They spent the rest of that day and the next in a bubble of happiness, working the ranch together, stealing kisses when the mood struck, learning each other's rhythms and preferences. Penelope discovered that Zane was an early riser who liked his coffee black and strong, that he could make her laugh with dry observations about the chickens' personalities, that he was gentle with the horses and patient with stubborn fence posts. Zane learned that Penelope was fiercer than she looked, that she had a sharp mind for numbers and planning, that she sang quietly to herself when she thought no one was listening. He learned the exact spot on her neck that made her gasp when he kissed it, learned that she liked to be held tight, learned that her smile could light up his whole world. On the third night after he'd stayed in the spare room, Penelope knocked on his door after they'd both retired for the evening. When he answered, shirtless and surprised, she nearly lost her nerve. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "No, I just—" She twisted her hands together. "I don't want to sleep alone tonight." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something darker and more intense. "Penelope, if I come to your room, I'm not sure I can be a gentleman about it. I'm not asking you to be." He stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything." That was all the invitation he needed. He pulled her into the room and kissed her with an urgency that made her knees weak. They stumbled together toward the bed, pulling at clothes, learning the feel of skin on skin. He was gentle with her, checking and rechecking that she wanted this, and when they finally came together it felt right in a way nothing else ever had. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I love you," he said into the darkness. "I know it's fast and I know it's complicated, but I love you." Tears pricked at her eyes. "I love you too, marry me." She lifted her head to look at him. "What? Marry me?" "I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never been more certain of anything. Marry me and we'll work this ranch together. We'll face my father together. We'll build a life together." He cupped her face in his hand. "Marry me, Penelope." "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and they made love again slowly, sealing their promises with their bodies. Reality crashed back in 2 days later when Gerald Walker returned from Denver and discovered his son hadn't been home in a week. Penelope was in her barn when she heard the thundering hooves, and she emerged to find Gerald Walker himself riding onto her property, his face purple with rage. "Where is he?" Gerald demanded, not bothering to dismount. Zane emerged from the house behind her, and his face went carefully blank when he saw his father. "I'm here. Get on your horse. We're leaving now." "No," the single word hung in the air. Gerald's eyes widened, then narrowed dangerously. "What did you say to me?" "I said no." Zane walked down the porch steps and came to stand beside Penelope, his hand finding hers. "I'm not coming back to your house. I'm staying here with Penelope. We're getting married." For a moment, Gerald looked so shocked he couldn't speak. Then his gaze swung to Penelope, and the hatred in it made her step back. "You," he spat. "You seduced my son. You're using him to get your hands on Walker money. She didn't seduce anyone, Zane said sharply. And I don't want your money, I want her. You're a fool, she's nothing. A nobody with a failing ranch and delusions of grandeur. That's enough. Zane's voice went cold and hard. You will not speak about her that way. I'll speak however I damn well please. You're my son, and you'll do as I say. I'm 25 years old, and I make my own choices. I choose Penelope. Gerald's face went from purple to an alarming shade of red. If you marry her, you're cut off. No money, no inheritance, no help from me ever again. You'll be on your own. I know. You'd give up everything for this woman, for this useless piece of land, in a heartbeat. Something shifted in Gerald's expression, and it frightened Penelope more than his rage had. He looked calculating now, dangerous in a different way. We'll see about that, Gerald said softly. Then he wheeled his horse around and galloped off, leaving dust hanging in the air behind him. Penelope turned to Zane, her heart hammering. What do you think he'll do? I don't know, but whatever it is, we'll face it together. She wanted to believe him, but she'd seen the look in Gerald Walker's eyes, and she knew they hadn't seen the last of his interference. The trouble started small. The general store suddenly refused to extend Penelope credit. The bank called in a small loan she had, demanding immediate payment. Men she'd hired for occasional work claimed they were too busy to help her anymore. It was subtle, but the message was clear. Gerald Walker was using his influence to squeeze her out, but Zane was true to his word. He used his own money to pay off her loan. He brought supplies from Denver where his father's influence didn't reach. He worked the ranch himself, putting in 18-hour days to make up for the labor she couldn't hire. 3 weeks after their engagement, they rode into town together to see the preacher about setting a wedding date. Heads turned as they walked down the main street, hands linked. Penelope could hear the whispers starting, could feel the weight of judgment and gossip. Ignore them, Zane murmured. Easy for you to say. You're not the one they're calling a gold digger. His hand tightened on hers. Anyone who says that to your face will answer to me. Reverend Thomas agreed to marry them, though he looked uncomfortable about the whole situation. They set the date for the first Saturday in November, just 3 weeks away. It would be a simple ceremony at the church with a few witnesses. Nothing fancy, but Penelope didn't care. She just wanted to be Zane's wife. As they left the church, they nearly collided with Margaret Walker. Zane's mother looked startled to see them, then pained. "Zane," she said softly. "Son." "Mother." His voice was formal, and Penelope could feel the tension in him. Margaret's eyes moved to Penelope, and to her surprise they were kind. "Miss Zimmerman, I've heard about your engagement." "I'm sure you have, madam. I wonder if I might speak with you both, privately." They found a quiet spot behind the church, away from prying eyes. Margaret wrung her hands, clearly struggling with what to say. "Your father is planning something," she finally said to Zane. "I don't know exactly what, but I've heard him talking with his lawyer. They're trying to find a way to take Miss Zimmerman's property by force." Penelope's blood ran cold. "He can't do that. It's my land, free and clear. There are always ways if someone is ruthless enough and has enough money." Margaret looked at her son. "I can't stop him, Zane. I've tried, but he won't listen to me." "I'm not surprised." Zane's jaw was tight. "Thank you for warning us." Margaret reached out and touched his cheek, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You're the best of us, you know, better than your father ever was. Don't let him poison what you found with this young woman." "I won't." She nodded, then turned to Penelope. "I hope you'll let me attend the wedding. I know I have no right to ask, given what my husband has done, but I'd like to be there." Penelope was surprised to find she meant it when she said, "You're welcome to come, Mrs. Walker." They parted ways, and Zane and Penelope rode back to her ranch in tense silence. The happiness of their engagement was being overshadowed by Gerald's machinations, and Penelope could feel the stress wearing on both of them. That night as they lay in bed, Penelope traced the lines of worry on Zane's forehead. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said softly. "I'm thinking I should have seen this coming, should have had a plan. We have a plan. We're getting married and we're keeping this ranch. But what if he succeeds? What if he finds a way to take it from you?" She caught his face between her hands, making him look at her. "Then we'll fight him. And if we lose the ranch, we'll go somewhere else and start over. As long as I have you, the rest is just land and buildings." His eyes searched hers. "You mean that?" "I mean it. I love this place, but I love you more. Don't you dare let your father make you doubt that." He pulled her close and held her tight, and she could feel him trembling slightly. This strong, capable man was afraid, and it broke her heart even as it made her more determined than ever to fight for what they had. The next blow came a week before the wedding. The sheriff showed up at Penelope's door with a surveyor and a stack of papers. They claimed the property line between her ranch and the Walker spread had been incorrectly marked years ago, and that 20 acres of what she thought was her land actually belonged to the Walkers. 20 acres that included her best pasture and her primary water source. "This is ridiculous," Penelope said, staring at the documents. "My father had this land surveyed when he bought it. The markers are clear." "The markers have been challenged," the sheriff said uncomfortably. He was a decent man named Bill Crawford, and he clearly didn't like being in the middle of this. "Mr. Walker has presented evidence that the original survey was faulty. We need to do a new survey to verify." "Evidence that he probably forged," Zane said angrily. "That's not for me to say. I'm just here to inform Miss Zimmerman that until this is settled, she needs to keep her cattle off the disputed land." It took 3 hours for the surveyor to do his work. Penelope and Zane followed him around the property, watching with growing dread as he took measurements and made notes. When he finally rendered his verdict, it was worse than they'd feared. "Based on the documentation I've been provided and my own measurements, I have to conclude that the current property markers are indeed incorrect. The land in question should be marked approximately 100 yards east of the current line. 100 yards, which meant Gerald Walker was claiming not just her best pasture, but her barn as well." "You're saying my barn is on Walker property?" Penelope's voice came out strangled. "According to these documents, yes, madam." "Those documents are fraudulent," Zane said flatly. "My father is lying." Sheriff Crawford shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Walker, I understand you're upset, but I can't ignore legal documents. Until this is sorted out in court, Miss Zimmerman needs to respect the new property line." "How long will a court case take?" Penelope asked, though she already knew the answer would be bad. Could be months, maybe longer. Months without access to her barn or her best pasture. Months of legal fees she couldn't afford. Months of watching Gerald Walker win. After the sheriff and surveyor left, Penelope stood in her yard and looked at the new stakes they'd driven into the ground, marking the corrected property line. Fury and despair warred inside her. "He's going to take everything," she said numbly. "No, he's not." Zane's voice was hard with determination. "We're going to fight this. With what money? I can barely afford to keep the ranch running as it is. I can't hire a lawyer. Then we'll represent ourselves. Or I'll sell some of my things. I've got a good horse and some savings my grandfather left me that my father doesn't know about." She turned to him. "I can't let you do that. You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to do it." He pulled her into his arms. "Penelope, listen to me. My father is counting on us giving up. He thinks if he makes things hard enough, we'll fold, but we're not going to give him that satisfaction." "I'm scared," she admitted. "Me too, but we're scared together and that makes us stronger." She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. so she nodded against his chest and held on tight. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Zane sold his prize stallion to a rancher in Denver for enough money to hire a lawyer. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Sarah Mitchell who had recently moved to Pueblo from Kansas City, listened to their story and examined the documents with a skeptical eye. "These are definitely suspicious," she said, tapping the papers Gerald had submitted. "The dates don't quite line up and the signature of the original surveyor looks off to me, but proving forgery is difficult and it will take time." "How much time?" Penelope asked. 3 months minimum. Maybe 6 months. The wedding was in 4 days. How were they supposed to start a marriage under this cloud of uncertainty? But Zane squeezed her hand and said, "Then we'll take 6 months. We're not going anywhere." Sarah Mitchell smiled slightly. "You two are either very brave or very foolish, possibly both, but I'll take your case. Gerald Walker has made a lot of enemies in this town over the years. I suspect we'll find people willing to testify about his character and business practices." It was something. Not much, but something. On the first Saturday in November 1882, Penelope Zimmerman married Zane Walker in a simple ceremony at the Pueblo Community Church. Margaret Walker sat in the front row, crying quietly. Thomas Walker, Zane's younger brother, served as best man, having defied his father to attend. A few of Penelope's friends from town came as well, along with Sarah Mitchell, and a handful of ranch hands who'd remained loyal despite Gerald's interference. Gerald himself was notably, furiously absent. Penelope wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame. Zane wore his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed for once. When Reverend Thomas asked if anyone objected to the marriage, everyone in the church held their breath, half expecting Gerald to burst through the doors. But no one came, and the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and when Zane kissed her, it felt like sealing a promise bigger than both of them. The reception was held at the church hall, a modest affair with cake and punch and fiddle music. Penelope danced with her new husband, then with Thomas, who told her quietly that he was glad Zane had found someone worth fighting for. "He's always done what Father wanted," Thomas said as they turned across the floor. "Always tried to be the perfect son. You're the first thing he's ever chosen for himself." "I'm going to make him happy," Penelope promised. "I believe you." As the sun set, Zane and Penelope rode back to her ranch. Their ranch now, she supposed, though nothing had been formally transferred yet. That was another complication they'd have to sort out. But tonight, she didn't want to think about complications. Tonight she just wanted to be with her husband. They made love in the house she'd grown up in the bed she'd inherited from her parents, and it felt like christening something new. Afterward, Zane held her close and whispered, "Mrs. Walker." She wrinkled her nose. "That's going to take some getting used to. Don't like being a Walker, I like being your wife. The name is just going to confuse people when your father's also a Walker. Then we'll do something different. Keep Zimmerman if you want, or hyphenate, or come up with something entirely new." She loved him for offering, for understanding that her name was tied to her identity and her family legacy. "I'll think about it." They fell asleep tangled together, and for a few hours everything was perfect. Reality reasserted itself over the following weeks as they settled into married life under siege. Gerald ramped up his campaign to make their lives difficult. He spread rumors in town that Penelope had been pregnant before the wedding, that she'd trapped Zane into marriage. He convinced several of Penelope's remaining customers to stop buying her beef. He even tried to have the sheriff arrest Zane for trespassing when he was seen on the disputed land. Through it all, Zane and Penelope held fast to each other. They worked the ranch from dawn until dusk, making do with limited resources. They learned to rely on the few friends who remained loyal. They found small joys in shared meals and quiet evenings by the fire, and slowly, Sarah Mitchell built their case. She tracked down the original surveyor, who confirmed that his signature on Gerald's documents had been forged. She found 3 other ranchers who testified that Gerald had tried similar schemes with them over the years. She uncovered financial records, showing that Gerald had paid a substantial sum to a known forger shortly before filing his claim. The case finally went before a judge in February of 1883. The courtroom was packed with townspeople eager to see the showdown between Gerald Walker and his son. Gerald sat at the plaintiff's table with his expensive lawyer, radiating confidence. Zane and Penelope sat with Sarah, holding hands under the table. The trial lasted 3 days. Sarah presented her evidence methodically and thoroughly. Gerald's lawyer tried to discredit the witnesses and muddy the waters, but the facts were damning. On the 3rd day, the judge rendered his verdict. "I find the evidence of forgery compelling and troubling," Judge Harrison said, his voice grave. "The property markers will be restored to their original locations, and Mr. Gerald Walker is hereby ordered to pay court costs and a fine for filing a fraudulent claim. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for possible criminal charges." The courtroom erupted. Penelope sagged with relief and Zane pulled her into a fierce embrace. Across the room, Gerald stood frozen, his face mottled with rage. "This isn't over," he said loudly enough to Carrie. "You hear me, Zane? This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Zane replied calmly. "You lost, Father. Accept it." But as they left the courthouse, Penelope couldn't shake the feeling that Gerald's threat wasn't empty. A man like that didn't simply give up. She was proven right 3 weeks later when a fire broke out in their barn in the middle of the night. Penelope woke to Zane shaking her, shouting about smoke. They ran outside in their nightclothes to find the barn fully engulfed, flames leaping into the dark sky. They managed to get the horses out, but the barn itself was a total loss. As they stood watching it burn, waiting for help that wouldn't arrive in time, Zane's arm tight around her shoulders, Penelope saw a figure on horseback in the distance, silhouetted against the flames. She couldn't prove it was Gerald, but she knew. The fire devastated them financially. Everything stored in the barn was destroyed: equipment, feed, and supplies. The structure itself would cost hundreds of dollars to rebuild. Insurance wouldn't cover it, claiming it was arson and therefore the Zimmerman-Walker responsibility to prove who'd done it. For the first time since their marriage, Penelope felt truly hopeless. They'd won the court case only to lose their barn. It felt like Gerald was determined to destroy them one way or another. "Maybe we should just leave," she said one night as they surveyed the charred remains. "Sell the land, take what we can get, and start fresh somewhere else." Zane was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Is that really what you want?" "I don't know what I want anymore. I'm tired, Zane. I'm tired of fighting your father, tired of scraping by, tired of waiting for the next disaster." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I understand. I'm tired too, but if we leave, he wins. He gets what he wanted all along, your land, and it sets a precedent that he can bully anyone into submission. I don't care about precedents, I care about us having a future. Our future is here. I feel it, Penelope. This land, this ranch, it's meant to be ours, together, but I won't force you to stay if you truly want to go, it's your choice." She looked out at the property. Even damaged and under siege, it was still beautiful. The land her father had loved, that her mother had helped build. The place where she'd fallen in love with Zane. Home. "I don't want to leave," she admitted. "I just don't know how to keep going, one day at a time. We rebuild the barn ourselves. I've still got some money left from selling the stallion. We buy lumber and we put it up ourselves, just the two of us if we have to. That will take months. Then it takes months. We're young, we have time." She looked up at him, this man who'd given up everything for her, who worked himself to exhaustion every day, who still found ways to make her smile even when everything seemed impossible. How could she do anything less than fight as hard as he was fighting? "Okay," she said. "We rebuild." They started the next day. Zane drove to Denver and came back with a wagon full of lumber and supplies. They drafted plans for a new barn, simpler than the old one but functional, and they began to build. It was backbreaking work. Penelope had never done construction before, and her hands blistered and bled before they finally toughened up. Zane worked until he could barely stand, then got up the next morning and did it again. They made mistakes and had to tear down and rebuild. They argued about the best way to do things. They collapsed into bed each night too exhausted for anything but sleep. But slowly the barn took shape. A frame, then walls, then a roof. By late April it was finished. Not fancy but solid and weatherproof, and theirs. The day they moved the horses into the new barn, Penelope cried. Zane held her and cried too, both of them releasing months of tension and fear and determination. "We did it," she said, laughing through her tears. "We did." That night they celebrated by making love in the hayloft of their new barn, giggling like teenagers when the hay scratched their skin. Afterward, lying wrapped in blankets with the stars visible through gaps in the roof boards, Penelope felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Spring turned to summer, and life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. The crops they'd planted grew tall and green. The cattle fattened on summer grass. Penelope discovered she was pregnant in July, and the joy of it overshadowed even her lingering worries about Gerald. "We're having a baby," she told Zane, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. He picked her up and spun her around, whooping with delight, then set her down carefully like she was made of glass. "When?" "February, the doctor thinks. Maybe March. A baby." He said it like he couldn't quite believe it. Then his face split into the biggest smile she'd ever seen, and he kissed her until she was breathless. "We're having a baby." They told Thomas first, who was visiting from Denver where he'd finally gotten a job at a law firm. He congratulated them and toasted their news with expensive wine he'd brought from the city. Margaret came to visit a week later, defying Gerald's prohibition on seeing her eldest son. She cried when Penelope told her about the baby and promised to help however she could. "Your father knows, doesn't he?" Zane asked his mother quietly. Margaret nodded. "He knows. He's not happy about it." "I don't care if he's happy." "I know. But be careful, both of you. He's been drinking more lately, saying strange things. I think losing the court case did something to him. Made him more unpredictable." The warning proved prophetic. 2 weeks later, Gerald showed up at the ranch, drunk and raging. Penelope was alone, Zane having gone to town for supplies. She saw Gerald coming and grabbed her rifle, meeting him in the yard. "Get off my property," she said, the rifle steady in her hands despite her fear. Gerald swayed in his saddle, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. "Your property. It's all your fault. You ruined my son, turned him against his own family." Zane made his own choices. "He was a good son until you got your hooks into him. Now he's nothing. A disgrace. Building barns like a common laborer, married to a woman who'll never be good enough." The words stung, but Penelope kept her voice level. "Leave now or I'll shoot you for trespassing." "You won't shoot me." "You're too weak. That's why you needed my son, because you can't handle this place alone." "I'm not alone, and I'm warning you one last time. Leave." Gerald's hand moved toward his hip, and Penelope's finger tightened on the trigger. For a moment they stared at each other, and she could see him calculating whether she'd really shoot. Then hoofbeats sounded behind her, and Zane rode into the yard at a gallop. He took in the scene instantly, dismounting and moving to stand beside Penelope. "Get out," he said to his father, his voice cold as winter. "And don't come back. You choose her over me, your own father, every single time." Something in Gerald seemed to break then. His shoulders sagged, and suddenly he looked old and tired instead of threatening. "You're dead to me," he said quietly. "You hear that, Zane? As far as I'm concerned, I have no eldest son. I can live with that." Gerald stared at him for another long moment, then wheeled his horse around and rode away. They watched until he was out of sight, then Penelope lowered the rifle with shaking hands. "Are you all right?" Zane asked, pulling her into his arms. "I thought he was going to shoot me." "He was drunk enough he might have tried. Thank God I got back when I did." They stood there holding each other, and Penelope felt the baby flutter inside her for the first time. A tiny kick, a reminder of the life they'd created together. She took Zane's hand and placed it on her belly. "Feel that?" His eyes went wide. "Is that the baby? That's our baby." He knelt down and pressed his face to her stomach, and she ran her fingers through his hair. And in that moment, she knew everything they'd been through had been worth it. Every fight, every setback, every moment of fear and doubt had led them to this. A life built together, a family of their own. The rest of the pregnancy passed peacefully. Gerald kept his distance, though Margaret reported he'd grown more reclusive and bitter. Thomas visited when he could, already planning to be the best uncle. Sarah Mitchell stopped by to check on them and stayed for dinner, becoming a friend as well as a lawyer. Penelope worked the ranch until she couldn't anymore, then drove Zane crazy with restlessness as she waited for the baby to come. He was endlessly patient with her mood swings and discomfort, rubbing her feet and building her a rocking chair and reading to her from the newspaper in the evenings. Their son was born on a cold February night in 1884, arriving in a rush after only 4 hours of labor. Zane was there throughout, holding Penelope's hand and whispering encouragement. When the doctor finally placed the baby in her arms, she looked into his tiny red face and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "He's perfect," she breathed. "He's beautiful," Zane agreed, tears streaming down his face. "What should we name him?" They'd discussed names for months but never settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Penelope knew exactly what felt right. "Robert," she said. "After my father, Robert Walker," Zane smiled. "Robert Walker." "I like it. He'd have been proud to have a grandson named after him." "What about a middle name, Thomas, after my brother, Robert Thomas Walker?" She tested the name, and it felt solid and right. "Yes, that's perfect." They spent the first few weeks in a haze of exhaustion and wonder, learning to be parents. Robert was a good baby, fussy only when hungry or tired. Zane was a natural father, patient and gentle and endlessly fascinated by their son. Penelope watched him walk the floor with Robert in the middle of the night, singing off key lullabies, and fell in love with him all over again. Margaret came to visit as soon as the roads were passable, bringing gifts and offering to help. She held her grandson with tears of joy, and Penelope felt a pang of sadness that Gerald was missing this because of his stubborn pride. "Has he asked about the baby?" she asked Margaret gently. The older woman's face crumpled. "No, he won't even let me mention Zane's name in the house. It's like he's trying to pretend his son never existed. I'm sorry. Don't be. Gerald made his choices and he'll have to live with them." Margaret looked up from the baby. "You've made Zane happier than I've ever seen him. You and this little one, you're his real family now." Spring came, and with it the railroad's final decision. A representative from the company visited the ranch to inform them that the tracks would indeed run through Penelope's northern pasture. They were prepared to offer $20,000 for the easement and guaranteed freight rates for her cattle. $20,000. More money than Penelope had ever imagined having. Enough to pay off every debt, modernize the ranch, build a proper house, secure their future. "What do you think?" she asked Zane after the representative left. "I think it's your land and your decision. It's our land now, our decision." He considered for a moment. The noise and disruption will be hard during construction. But once it's done, having easy access to freight trains could be incredibly valuable. We could expand the herd, maybe even start breeding horses again. And that money would give us security I never thought we'd have. So we should accept. I think we should. But only if you're comfortable with it. They accepted the railroad's offer. Construction began in June and lasted through the summer, turning their northern pasture into a chaos of activity. But by September, the tracks were laid and the workers were gone, leaving them with a check for $20,000 and a train that ran past their property twice a day. The money transformed everything. They paid off all debts, bought new equipment, hired 2 ranch hands to help with the heavy work. Zane started breeding horses using stock he purchased from a ranch in Wyoming. Penelope bought more cattle and expanded into selling beef directly to restaurants in Denver. By their 3rd anniversary in November of 1885, the ranch was thriving. Robert was walking and talking, a bright, happy toddler who loved following his father around. Penelope was pregnant again, due in the spring. And they'd just finished building a new house, larger than the old one, with a real bedroom for Robert and a nursery for the new baby, and a wide porch where they could sit and watch the sunset. "Look at what we built," Zane said one evening as they stood on that new porch, his arms around her, watching Robert chase chickens in the yard. "Look at what we survived," Penelope countered. "Your father trying to destroy us, the fire, all those months of barely scraping by. Worth it, though. Every second of it if it brought us here." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever regret it, giving up your inheritance, getting cut off from your father?" "Never, not once." He kissed her forehead. "I got something better than an inheritance. I got you and Robert and this life we built together. That's worth more than all my father's money and approval. I love you. I love you too, more every day." Their daughter was born in April of 1886, a tiny perfect girl with Zane's blue eyes and Penelope's dark hair. They named her Margaret Rose, after Zane's mother and Penelope's mother. Thomas came from Denver to meet his niece, and Margaret visited every week to help with the 2 young children. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch continued to prosper. Robert grew into a smart, curious boy who loved horses and wanted to be a cowboy like his father. Margaret Rose was a happy baby who rarely cried. Zane and Penelope worked side by side during the days and fell into bed exhausted but content each night. In the summer of 1887, word reached them that Gerald Walker had died of a heart attack. Zane took the news quietly, his face unreadable. They attended the funeral out of respect for Margaret, standing at the back of the church while the preacher praised Gerald's business acumen and community standing. Afterward, Margaret pulled Zane aside. "He left you something," she said quietly. "Half of his estate. He changed his will 6 months ago, though he never told anyone." Zane looked stunned. "Why would he do that?" "Because at the end, I think he realized what he'd lost. He asked about you and Penelope and the children. I showed him the photographs I'd taken. He just stared at them for a long time, and then he said he'd been a fool." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "It doesn't excuse what he did to you both, but I thought you should know that he regretted it." Zane was quiet on the ride home. That evening, after the children were in bed, he and Penelope sat on their porch and talked. "Are you going to accept the inheritance?" she asked. "I don't know. Part of me wants to refuse it, send it all back. But the practical part knows that money could do a lot of good. We could expand further, maybe buy the Morrison property like my father wanted to. Set up trusts for Robert and Margaret Rose." "What does your heart say?" he thought for a long moment. "My heart says my father spent his life chasing money and power, and it made him miserable. I don't want to follow that path, but I also think refusing his money out of spite or pride would be its own kind of foolishness." "So what will you do?" "Accept it, but use it differently than he would have. Use it to build something good, something that helps people instead of crushing them." He looked at her. "What do you think?" "I think that sounds exactly right." They used part of Gerald's inheritance to buy the Morrison property, expanding their ranch to over 500 acres. They also donated money to build a new school in Pueblo, established a fund to help young ranchers get started, and set aside college money for their children. The years rolled on, bringing new challenges and new joys. They had a third child in 1889, another son they named Daniel. Robert grew into a capable young ranch hand, learning the business from his father. Margaret Rose was bright and curious, constantly asking questions. Daniel was the wild one, always getting into trouble but impossible not to love. In 1892, Penelope and Zane celebrated their 10th anniversary with a party attended by half the town. Sarah Mitchell came, now a judge herself. Thomas brought his new wife, a Denver lawyer named Emma. Margaret was there, looking happy and relaxed in a way she never had when Gerald was alive. As Penelope danced with her husband under lantern light, surrounded by friends and family, she thought about how far they'd come. From two people on opposite sides of a property line and a grudge to this. A partnership, a marriage, a family, a life built together through determination and love. "What are you thinking about?" Zane asked, pulling her closer. "How you crossed that property line one night to shoot a coyote and never left," he laughed. "Best decision I ever made." "Second best. The first best was when you decided to stay." "Actually, the best decision was when I fell in love with you. Everything else just followed naturally." She kissed him there in front of everyone, not caring who saw, because he was right. The love had come first, unexpected and inconvenient and absolutely perfect. Everything else, all the success and happiness they'd found, had grown from that seed. By the time their 20th anniversary rolled around in 1902, the ranch was one of the most successful operations in Colorado. Robert, now 18, was preparing to go to college to study agriculture. Margaret Rose, 16, wanted to be a teacher. Daniel, at 13, was already taller than his father and showed promise as a horse trainer. The house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. The barn they'd rebuilt after the fire was now one of 3 barns on the property. The railroad that had once seemed like such a disruption was now an integral part of their operation, shipping cattle and horses all over the country. But more important than any material success was the family they'd built. The love that had started with 2 stubborn people refusing to give up on each other had grown and deepened over 20 years of marriage. They'd weathered Gerald's attacks, financial hardships, the challenges of raising children, and the everyday struggles of running a ranch. Through it all, they'd chosen each other every single day. On their anniversary, Zane took Penelope back to the spot where he'd first kissed her, that fence line in the south pasture. The fence was long gone now, the property fully integrated into one large ranch. But they could still remember exactly where it had been. "Right here," Penelope said, touching a rock that marked the spot. "You kissed me right here and changed my whole life." "You kissed me back," Zane pointed out. "That was the real game changer." They stood together looking out over land that was truly theirs now, earned through years of hard work and love. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. In the distance, they could see the ranch house with smoke rising from the chimney, could hear the faint sounds of their children laughing. "Would you do it all again?" Penelope asked. "If you could go back to that night when you crossed the property line, knowing everything that was coming, would you still do it?" Zane didn't hesitate. "Every time. I'd cross that line 1,000 times to get to this moment right here with you." She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her, and they watched the sun set on 20 years of marriage and a lifetime of love still stretching out before them. In 1905, Robert married a local girl named Sarah and started his own ranch on a portion of the property. Margaret Rose finished her teaching degree and took a position at the school Penelope, and Zane had funded. Daniel went to work full-time on the ranch, showing a natural talent for breeding horses that reminded everyone of his father. Penelope and Zane became grandparents in 1906 when Robert and Sarah had a son. More grandchildren followed over the years, filling the ranch house with noise and laughter. They watched their children build their own lives, start their own families, chase their own dreams. In 1910, Margaret Walker passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72. They buried her next to Gerald in the Pueblo cemetery, and Zane cried for the mother who had supported him even when it meant defying her husband. Thomas retired from his law practice and moved back to Colorado in 1912, buying a small house in Pueblo to be closer to his brother and nephews and nieces. He and Emma became regular fixtures at the ranch, spending holidays and birthdays surrounded by family. The years continued their steady march forward. The world changed around them. Automobiles replaced horses on the streets of Pueblo. The telephone came to town. The ranch installed electricity in 1915, a modern marvel that the grandchildren took for granted, but that still amazed Penelope. Through all the changes, the constants remained. The land, rich and productive. The ranch, prosperous and well-run. And most importantly, the love between Penelope and Zane, as strong at 30 years of marriage as it had been at the beginning. By their 40th anniversary in 1922, they had 8 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. Robert was running the ranch now, with Daniel as his partner. Margaret Rose was the principal of the Pueblo school. The property had grown to over 1,000 acres, and the Walker name was synonymous with quality cattle and horses throughout Colorado. But Penelope and Zane didn't care much about the business legacy. What mattered to them were the quiet mornings on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. The dinners surrounded by children and grandchildren. The nights still spent wrapped in each other's arms after 4 decades of marriage. "We did good," Penelope said one evening as they sat on the porch, now in their 60s but still healthy and active. "We did better than good. We built something that'll last. Think the kids will keep it going. I know they will." Robert's got a good head on his shoulders and Daniel's got the passion. Margaret Rose will make sure the next generation gets educated. We raised them right. Penelope thought about those early days when she'd been alone on a failing ranch, when Zane had crossed the property line and never left, when they'd fallen in love despite every reason not to. How terrified she'd been. How uncertain their future had seemed. And now here they were, 40 years later, surrounded by the life they'd built together. A life that started with a grudge and ended with love. A life that had required courage and determination and faith and stubbornness and trust. "I'd do it all again," she said, echoing their conversation from years ago. Zane reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers as naturally as breathing. "Me too. every single second. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over their land, the land they'd fought for and bled for and loved. Somewhere in the house behind them, grandchildren were laughing. In the barn, horses were settling in for the night. On the distant hills, cattle grazed peacefully. And on the porch of the ranch house they'd built together, Penelope and Zane Walker held hands and watched the day fade into night, knowing that whatever years remained to them would be spent exactly as they'd spent the last 40, side by side in love, and exactly where they were meant to be. The property line that had once divided them was long gone, erased by time and love and the life they'd built together. But neither of them had forgotten that night when Zane had crossed it, chasing a coyote and finding something infinitely more valuable. He'd crossed a line and found his future. He'd crossed a line and never left. And in the end, that made all the difference.